So, thank you for this opportunity to talk about this topic. It's not directly related to Gothic, but as we will see throughout the talk, there are some themes that are slightly in common. And first of all, so content warning, there will be some difficult contents throughout the lecture. Feel free to leave anytime. When the volume of violence is a bit turned on at the maximum, I added some content warnings, of course, in the slides, but yeah, feel free to leave and come back and so on whenever. But the first part will be rather general and non-violent, let's say, compared to the rest. The second part will be rather violent, and there will be a part about Millennium by Stieg Larsson. So this one is very problematic for some people. So feel free to leave when you see the introduction to that part. So my background is not in Nordic literature per se. I have a BA in Nordic studies, focusing on Scandinavian philology. But I'm currently a PhD student at the Department of History at Palacký University in Olomouc. So in case you're wondering where it is, it's in the middle of Europe, basically, near Vienna, Bratislava, and Krakow. So it's really in the middle of Europe, in the Czech Republic. So I decided to do this also because this year, because we lost this year the second of two of the founders of the genre. So it's my Cheval. She died earlier this year. So it's a good way to pay tribute to her and her partner's work in terms of literature, Nordic literature. So first, because I do not assume that you have any knowledge or background regarding Nordic studies or Nordic literature, everything like this, I will quickly go through some terminology before going through some general context information so that everyone has the same basic knowledge to start with. So in terms of terminology, first is the term Nordic and the term Scandinavian. I will use both, and they're not interchangeable, basically. They are two different things. Nordic countries are considered to be Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, including Svalbard, Sweden, plus Greenland on Denmark's side, and Faroe Islands on Denmark's side as well. Greenland being autonomous with a high level, let's say, of autonomy, but not entirely independent. And in today's talk, I will include in the definition of Nordic Estonia, even though they are not technically Nordic because they do not belong to the Nordic Council. So politically, they're not Nordic countries. They're Baltic countries sometimes, but they're actually in between. So regarding literature and especially Nordic Noir, there are lots of things in common. So I decided to include it as well because I think it's relevant and it adds a layer that could be interesting. What is Scandinavian countries? Basically, the definition is mainly rooted in linguistics. Originally, it's a family of languages, and sometimes some people include Icelandic in it, but let's say that technically it's Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian, and all their different dialects and versions, because it's quite a variety of languages actually. But so these are the Scandinavian countries: Denmark, Norway, and Sweden only. Without Greenland. Greenland is not a country with Scandinavian language, even though Danish is an official language over there. They actually, the indigenous population there has its own language, which is Inuktitut. So it's not a Scandinavian language. It's not a Scandinavian country. Same Faroe Islands are not included in that definition because Faroesian is a language that is related to Icelandic more than any other language, and even though Icelandic is linked somehow to Scandinavian language, like Latin is linked to Italian, Spanish, French, and so on, it's still a different language. So that's first layer of background. Second layer of background is why are we using the term Nordic Noir and not another term like crime novels? If you Google most of the authors that I'm going to talk about today, you will find out that in Wikipedia and other sources, they use the term crime novels or thrillers or suspense novels and so on. And it's not really right, let's say. It doesn't match what Nordic Noir is actually for real. So it's not crime fiction because crime fiction is focusing on the crime itself and the investigation as a process. So the entire investigation is shown, and this is the main scenario basically, and very little attention is given to the characters. Sometimes you have a lot of information about the background, political background, or landscapes and so on, but these are general backgrounds. It's not about the topic, and the murders are usually not linked to complex stories and so on. The example of Agatha Christie, in case you're wondering, to just have a reference in mind. Then it's not a mystery novel either, because mystery novels are still focusing on crimes. We're getting a bit closer to Nordic Noir because of unsolved cases and this way of revealing certain things slowly throughout the novel. An example with P.D. James. So there is a bit of suspense throughout, whereas in crime fiction, sometimes you know who is the murderer from the beginning, and the process of the investigation is what matters. In mystery novels, you might find out who is the murderer later in the book. Thriller, still not quite like Nordic Noir, even though we're really getting closer if we're mixing mystery and thriller novels, basically. If we're mixing those two and we keep some aspects of crime fiction, then with those three, maybe we have something getting close to Nordic Noir. The thriller novel, the specificity is that it adds a lot of suspense with a bit of anxiety, and sometimes there is this horror-like atmosphere that we find in Nordic Noir as well. But in thriller novels, you don't have systematically a crime to be solved. It's not the main point in the plot or in the story. So again, that's not matching with Nordic Noir. As we will see, there are most of the time crimes to be solved in this time. So what is Nordic Noir and why do we use the term noir? The term noir in French in literal translation means black, but in this case, it does not mean black. It means dark, rather. That would be a better translation. So the noir atmosphere is really important. It's an atmosphere, it's not a topic. That's very important because for crime novels, you have a topic, crime, in the name of the genre. In mystery novel, you have the main element, mystery. In Nordic Noir, or any noir actually, of any kind, you don't really have a topic or a theme or even an aspect that is shown clearly. So that's interesting. Noir is not only about literature, and it's not only Nordic. In the 40s and 50s, you had this film noir in French. I will pronounce it with the French way, film noir. And this was coined by Nino Frank in 1946, this term, and really used for certain films. These films were mostly made in the post-Great Depression era, mostly by Hollywood productions, and that means a lot of budget, which is very different from the literature aspect, because the noir fiction, especially in the Nordic case, has always been considered a subgenre, at least so far. And I remember when I was studying Nordic literature, we were talking about it, and basically my generation of students is the first generation that decided to study this and research this subgenre as an actual genre. And so I'm, of course, of the opinion that it's a natural genre, it's not a subgenre. And we'll see why, because it's very complex and so on. We'll see that. So it borrows lots of themes and topics sometimes, and small elements from other genres, like horror, but also Gothic, as we'll see. We will have some examples, so I will not say more about this for now. But the main aspect in Nordic Noir specifically is that good and evil, are not clearly defined. You have an anti-hero as main investigator. Usually, he has lots of flaws, or she or they have lots of flaws. And this is very important, because then the criminal sometimes is described as, well, with their own flaws as well, but also showing as much empathy as possible towards the criminals. And this means that you end up not knowing which you should be on the which person you should be on the side of. Sometimes you understand so much why the criminal reached that point that he had to kill someone. I say he because most of the criminals in these books are, that at least the books that I'm going to talk about, most of them are made. So that's why I end up using he, but sometimes you have also women who are criminals sometimes, but usually women are victims. So yeah, and very little representation for non-binary people, unfortunately so far. So yeah, but so this complexity of the personality of all the characters is making it more realistic than the traditional crime novel, where everything is following specific lines and specific patterns and so on. You don't have that in Nordic Noir, and you sometimes get lost, not knowing necessarily how to handle the information you get. Sometimes the hero is really not a good person. Sometimes he's working with people who are corrupt and so on. So yeah, you have this ambiguity. Now, in terms of the context, first, literature in general, because it's important to see how, well, the evolution. I'm trying to show the evolution in this part, so that you understand how we reached the point of having Nordic Noir with all those themes that we're going to talk about. So in Norway, the literature was quite well known, even outside of the country, since they received 3 Nobel Prizes in the early 20th century already. they were mostly focusing on philosophy and poetry, with a bit of idealism. And it was basically what you would call beautiful high culture, properly classic high culture kind of literature, with some experiments in terms of how to phrase things and so on. During the war, the country had a very specific experience of the war, and it was a sort of trauma for the population. So in the post-war period, when I'm talking about the war, I mean the Second World War, of course. The post-war period showed an obsession with first-hand reports from prisoners of war and survivors, survivors including Jewish people who either were hiding in Norway or elsewhere, or even worse, were in the camps, in the concentration camps, and they were returning to their homes in Norway. And so this, and when I say prisoners of war, you also have resistance, a very important resistance activity. So they were also included, and political opponents, dissidents, and various minorities as well. And this was the most important part of literature. It triggered in the 50s and 60s a movement of literature, engaged literature with social realism. So that's very interesting, because this corresponds to the decades when Nordic Noir as a genre started appearing, basically in the 50s, started appearing in Sweden. So you can see that there is already a shift towards more darker themes, basically, due to the impact of the war. In Denmark, you had, so throughout the 19th century, basically, you had this increase of nationalist sentiment all across Europe. But in Denmark, it was corresponding to a moment when people were losing almost faith in their nation because of wars that they had lost, and loss of influence and so on, and difficult relationship with Sweden, especially, and with Norway. So yeah, you have this context in the 19th century that led to a more nationalist literature in the beginning of the 20th century. And when I use nationalist here, I use it within the contemporary context. So nowadays we would say more like patriotic, maybe, because now nationalist is very negative. But in this case, in this context specifically, it was not negative. It was just about being proud of someone's nation, and it was not seen as negative back then. One of the main authors is Johannes V. Jansen, who wrote Kongens Fald, which means the King's Fall. It's a very interesting book, and it features all the traditional themes of this period in Danish literature, which was really dark already and getting into sometimes psychological trauma and so on. And even sometimes you also have some novels that were focusing on working class people who were starving to death and so on. So you have this very almost dystopian literature already in the beginning of the 20th century. Another important author is Karen Blixen. In Finland, you have a completely different story, because the late awakening of the Finnish national sentiment in the 19th century led to having the language, so the Finnish language was used in high culture very late, only from the end of, well, maybe mid 19th century, let's say. So it was very late compared to the rest of the Nordic countries. the Scandinavian countries had a long tradition of literature, and even Iceland with the sagas, you have a long tradition of written literature and even spoken tradition and so on in the beginning, oral tradition. Whereas in Finland, in Finnish specifically, you had some folk tales, but very little high culture developed until the 19th century. You have some examples with Alexis Kivi, Mika Vertari, and Eino Leino. They were focusing on poetry and fairy tales and this fantasy aspect and bringing back this beautiful nature and with beautiful words and so on, because that's how you show the beauty of your language when you're proud of your language and so on. And this is important, as we will see, for Nordic Noir, because all these aspects come back in Nordic Noir. Now, in Sweden, they get a slide just for them because it's the birthplace of Nordic Noir. So I really wanted to give a proper overview of this. So you have Selma Lagerlöf, Astrid Lindgren, who were two authors focusing on children's literature. And this shows the importance of children's literature. We will see that it comes back in many backgrounds of Nordic Noir authors, and even the last example that I will show features, well, it's kind of Nordic Noir and sort of children's literature at the same time. So that's important to keep in mind, that they were focusing on writing for children a lot compared to other countries. Most European countries were considering children's literature as not really important, whereas in Sweden it was huge. Then there is modernism and cynicism, and that appears from the beginning of the 20th century, with this proletarian literature appearing especially during the interwar period and later. The main figure for this side of proletarian literature is Moa Martinson. She was herself from working class background, and she was writing about working class women. And she was among the first authors who started using literature as a tool, not just to inform and educate the society, which was already the case with fairy tales. And if you know Christensen, for instance, Andersen and so on, this kind of fairy tales with a heavy education aspect. She was not just using the literature to educate, but also to reform, to try and show that there were solutions and so on. And this is very important in Nordic Noir as well. It's kind of passing on the legacy of this proletarian literature in a way sometimes. Then you have Per Olof Engqvist, who was doing documentary novels. So you have the introduction in literature of not just fiction, but non-fiction turned sometimes into fiction. So yeah, this use of history and contemporary events and so on to create novels. And last but not least, Lars Gustafsson, who was having fun mixing all the genres that he could write in, but also he was one of the main critics of the Swedish social welfare system through his literature, through his work. And for this, he was sidelined by the elite. He was not really appreciated by the elite in Stockholm because he was criticizing a lot what was happening. And as you can see, he was born in 1936. So by the time he was at around the age of 20, 30, when you could start really having a professional life and so on. Well, basically, that was when Nordic Noir was starting to appear, and that was when the welfare system was starting to appear as well, as we'll see. So the political context of Nordic countries, in the 50s and 60s, you have the establishment, as I just mentioned, of this, the Scandinavian welfare system. Focusing in the first phase, during those 2 decades, it was focusing on children and family, especially single parents, or more specifically, single mothers. This had its own share, its fair share of negative aspects as well, because as we will see, it led to policies that were very sexist and really violent towards women. But technically, it was meant for the better good of the society, of course. In Sweden, in the second half of the 20th century, you have mostly social democrats taking power, sometimes, well, not continuously, of course, but they had the upper hand most of the time. You have one specific prime minister who is really, really important for Swedes, Olof Palme. He was assassinated in '86, and that's one of the reasons why he is so important, because it was a trauma for the Swedish society. It was still in a time when politicians in Nordic countries did not have bodyguards, for instance, and they were just walking in Stockholm. He was the PM, and he was walking in Stockholm like this without any bodyguard, just going to the cinema and so on. And he was assassinated when he was going to the cinema. So yeah. The assassination has been kind of solved now. It took years. The person who is supposed to be the alleged murderer is dead already, because he committed suicide some time ago. But lots of people are still not sure about it, because the evidence is really not strong enough. It's not beyond reasonable doubt, which is important in justice. But, well, what we know is that the far right hated him, and he was criticized a lot because of his policies, which were favorable to immigrants and underprivileged populations and some minorities, not all of them, but at least some minorities. The main foreign policy was non-alignment. So Sweden was basically teaching lessons to everyone, whether the US or South Africa and the apartheid regime, or the USSR and so on. They were basically criticizing everyone and teaching lessons to everyone, saying, well, we will see that this attitude could trigger some negative perception regarding arrogance of Nordic countries and so on. In Norway, the left-wing government, it was mostly left-wing governments as well during the second half of the 20th century. The main person that I would like to highlight is Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the first woman to become prime minister in Norway. And she was focusing, of course, on women's rights, but also environment and health policies, public health. She had, and this was not because she was a woman, just saying, it was because she had a background in medicine, so she knew what she was doing. And she understood that basically through a good public health policy, you would have a better functioning society. That was her main ideas. In Denmark, the 20th century, and especially the second half of the 20th century, was mainly marked by issues with Greenland and Iceland. Iceland was declared its independence in 1944. These were very difficult topics because Nordic countries were teaching lessons to everyone, but Denmark remains to this day a slightly colonialist country, and I say slightly with a lot of sarcasm, since Greenland is still within their kingdom to this day. And they're not really treated properly, just saying. Another issue that was very present during the second half of the 20th century, and still to this day, was the minority rights and especially the Sami minority rights. So the Sami are our population, indigenous population, the only one recognized officially as such in Europe, and they are their territory is spread on 4 countries: Russia, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. It's in the north of those countries, and it triggers lots of issues, of course, because there are borders, and their main activity is reindeer herding, which goes across borders. So they have their own languages, lots of different languages. Sometimes people say there is one Sami language, but it's wrong. There are at least 3 different languages in just Sweden. So, and then at least 5 main in Norway. So that's how much the variety is. It's really a complex culture and so on. And then the issue more recently is the rise of far right with the party Sveriges Demokraterna that you might have heard of, because they're sometimes winning a lot. And we will talk about it later with Millennium. And last but not least, Sweden and Finland are not NATO members. So this shows the non-alignment tradition in their foreign policy, but also this creates a feeling of insecurity for the population sometimes, even though they are in close collaboration with NATO members, of course, and they are part of the EU and so on. So, yeah. So then, socio-economic context. After the Second World War, it's important to note that there was not a major economic crisis, as was the case elsewhere in Europe, because they were away from the front lines, and actually they used kind of used a lot the Third Reich in, well, at least Sweden especially used the Third Reich and the Allies whenever it was needed to maintain their economy and so on. But in the 60s and 70s, unemployment started rising, and the crisis started happening at an economic level and social level. The welfare system is, so to explain it very simply, sorry, I'm making lots of shortcuts, but well, I don't have much time and it would be an entire different talk anyway. So to summarize it quickly, high taxes for high quality of services offered by the state. So these countries are usually among the top in the world in terms of high taxation, income tax especially. In Norway and Iceland, it's different. Norway established its welfare system in 1964 to give you an idea where we are in the 20th century. They rely on natural resources, which creates a big conflict with Sami minorities because they are using the same land, and the use of natural resources is destroying their land, basically. So that's a big conflict, especially in Norway, and Sweden a lot as well, actually. Officially, you have a low level of criminality, but as we will see, it's just, well, it's relatively true, let's say. Let's summarize it like that. And what is important as well in terms of a socio-economic context and very specific to Nordic countries is the introduction of the union-based system. So basically, the government has to agree on many topics every 3 years or something like that. It depends on which country, with the unions, and almost the entire population, the entire working population is unionized. So it's very strong. And then most recently in Sweden, there were consent laws that I would like to mention because it's important with especially the background for Nordic Noir. Sweden is often seen as a very feminist country, and it's slightly true, especially for that, since now in Sweden, within a trial for sexual assault, you have the victim does not have to prove that there was an assault. It's not questioned that she might be the victim. It's switching, it's shifting the focus on whether the alleged attacker can actually prove that there was consent. So it's quite interesting as a debate. So the historical context, the Second World War was not, it was not lived the same way, let's say, so it was not experienced the same way in each Nordic country. In Sweden, you had a very controversial agreement with the Third Reich multiple times. They let soldiers, Nazi soldiers, go to throughout the country and so on to gather weapons and so on. But this allowed Sweden to avoid a lot of bloodshed and so on, let's say, if we want to find an excuse, let's say. And basically Sweden was the last safe haven, let's say, for Jews in Northern Europe. Even though they were still discriminated against and they were still threatened, but compared to other countries, they had a better situation, let's say, relatively better. For Finland and Denmark, they were occupied or puppet states. And Finland, it's interesting because you have this very difficult situation, and it's the same for Sweden, basically because Sweden defended Finland. So you had this war against Russia, and Russia was the archenemy for Finland. And so they did not care what side they were on in terms of what was happening with Germany, with Nazi Germany. And when you look at things, basically, if you fight against Russia, you're supposed to be on the side of Nazi Germany. So that's making it very complicated. But they were just defending their land in a way against an enemy that was really invasive. So that's a complex aspect of this period for Nordic countries. In Norway, the territory was occupied, and there is a heavy emphasis in historiography on passive resistance in the country. And it's interesting to note that King Håkon VII was in exile in London, like many other European governments. So yeah, they were officially neutral, but actually they were helping their allies multiple times, thanks to, for instance, ships and so on. The bad part that could go in also the political aspect, but I put it here, is that in the 50s and 60s, you have a very bad policy of eugenics and forced sterilization of women, especially working class women or women considered to be mentally ill. And back then, mentally ill meant anything from just laughing a bit too much or swearing a bit too much, these kind of things. If you did not have a proper behavior, you were considered as mentally ill or deviant at the very least. So these women were forced, sterilized by force, and this was a scandal later on, and we will see that it shows up in Nordic Noir. And so basically all this background is important because it shows up in specific examples that I'm going to show you. So now we are going to get slowly into more difficult content, just saying, in case some people are not sure they want to keep listening and so on, feel free to leave anytime. First, so I start with two light cases, and then I will switch on the volume gradually to make sure that it doesn't get too violent too quickly. So in the Icelandic case, I want to talk mostly about Arnardur Indridason, who is a historian by training, and he's also a journalist. And this is a very traditional, let's say, background for Nordic Noir authors. His first book in Nordic Noir with his main character, Erlendur, was published in 1997. Unfortunately, it hasn't been translated into English yet. So if anyone wants to get to work for that, that's an open call. Feel free to contact him. So yeah, he has not written just Nordic Noir. He also has a wartime series and some historical fiction like Codex Regius, which I highly recommend to anyone who is interested in medieval history because it focuses on the loss of manuscript that would be the main missing piece of the Edda and the sagas. Yeah, any medievalist knows that, and any historian actually knows that losing documents is really awful for historians and so on. It's really difficult. But he keeps a kind of atmosphere that is rather dark, and this is interesting, I think, to see that he's not leaving completely the Nordic Noir atmosphere behind, even in those books that are not directly crime related. In 2006, so the book that he published in 2000 was adapted in 2006 as a film. It was an Icelandic production. I'm going to talk about American productions a bit later, and that's why I'm highlighting when it's actually Nordic, because they do it much better. Spoiler alert. I'm going to not say good things about American productions. So I recommend you to watch this film because it's really beautiful and it shows a lot of the atmosphere. The main themes in his work are so disappearance and deadly cold. The explanation for that is that there are lots of cases of disappearance in snowstorms in Iceland, and he's a historian, so he knows all the stories from even the previous centuries. And basically, there were stories about people getting lost and even being found on the other side of their bodies were sometimes found. Most of the time, you did not find a body. So this could trigger stories that would involve some supernatural elements. But sometimes we were finding the bodies on the other side, basically, of the island because of the winds and because of the currents of the sea, basically around the ocean, around the currents are really strong and not going in a logical way, let's say, because you have the main stream, I don't remember the name of it, but the main stream that goes through the Atlantic, and this changes everything. And basically, there is a very difficult balance between cold and warm waters, and so the weather changes very quickly. And yeah, you can have snow during summer, and you can really nowadays the weather is warmer because of climate change. But yeah, you also have to keep in mind the violence of the nature there is also because there are earthquakes and volcanoes. So still exploding. I think everyone remembers Eyjafjallajökull a few years ago, and this kind of events happens still today. So you have this violent nature, and he uses that. For instance, in hypothermia, you can have it. And then he uses the history of Nordic countries. And that's the example in the Draining Lake, for instance, among others. He's using mostly the Cold War period and the Second World War because in Iceland, you had an American base, basically, and this was a big issue. This created a lot of issues. I won't talk too much about it because this way, if you want to know what type of problems it triggered, you have to read him. And then you have also the themes of racism and prejudices in Icelandic society, especially towards the Asian community, because it's the biggest community of immigrants in the country. And you find it in, for instance, Arctic Chill, which is featuring the Asian community, and basically people assume that the murderer is coming from this community, whereas maybe not. So then the main hero is an anti-hero. It's the first example we have of an anti-hero tonight, Erlendur. He's divorced, neglecting his daughter, so quite often he's finding her in difficult situations when it's really reaching the extreme because she has drug addiction issues. He's a smoker, and he has a very specifically Icelandic, I would say, childhood trauma, since he lost his brother in a snowstorm when he was under 10 years old. I don't remember the exact age, but he feels a lot of guilt about it, and he keeps this obsession with cases of disappearance of people. So when he sees a weird disappearance where nobody found the body yet and so on, he tends to look into that, and sometimes he finds out that it was a crime actually that was hidden as disappearance and so on. So you have these kind of themes. Now in Finland, you have a very different landscape, let's say, for Nordic Noir, with Leena Lehtolainen. She's not the only one. I forgot to say from the beginning, I'm using books and authors that I've read. Some of them I've met them. I have met Adler-Olsen, for instance. So some of them I've met them, and I chose in a very biased way, basically what I like and what I think shows the different characteristics. But there are plenty of authors, and if you want, feel free to contact me later. I can give you additional names, no problem. So Leena Lehtolainen is not just focusing on Nordic Noir, but those novels are the ones that got her a lot of awards and, let's say, international fame, since she has her books translated in, I don't remember, 30 languages or something like that. So, and same for Larsson, his novels are translated in over 40 languages. So, yeah, it's a style that really exports well, obviously. So her main character is Maria Carrillo, who is not really an anti-hero per se, let's say, but her background is not easy and nice, let's say. In the first book, she has a long-distance relationship that is going slightly complicated because her partner is, whose name is Auntie, is based in the US, and so it's making things complicated because she's too busy as a police woman, and she doesn't have the time to really talk to him sometimes and so on. And she neglects basically her personal life, which is a pattern among heroes of or main characters of Nordic Noir. She has a sort of difficult situation regarding her childhood. She hates facing it, basically. And this reflects in the themes, because apart from nature and arts, you have the theme of teenagers and the teenage period, and the relationships between teenagers and how it evolves and so on. She's assisted by someone called Koivu, which is the name of my cat, and this is a very interesting character. I really like this character because He's a man who was raised in a very traditional, conservative, almost machist uh, tradition, let's say, yeah, and yet he has the Nordic touch, let's say, because he's living in Finland, and so he is always going from being a bit machist gentleman kind of person, especially for Nordic standards, and then going back and forth between this and being an actual feminist man who is supporting his partner both in personal life and his partner in professional life, Maria. So it's interesting to see this this sort of binary hesitation between what happened, what used to be, and what is now, the identity of Nordic countries. The presence of nature and arts is not, so some people tend to say that it's because she's a woman. So of course women are interested in nature, beautiful things, humanities, and so on. Truth is, if you remember, I mentioned that it's actually in the tradition, in the literature tradition of Finland, to focus on those themes. So it's actually not because she's a woman, but more like because she's Finnish and she's writing based on the Kalevala and this kind of tradition. And personal stories are so important in her books that sometimes that's where the key to murders are found. So that's important. And just before the break, Jonas Bö, of course, I could not not talk about him. The most well-known, I would say, after the Swedish ones that I will mention later. So Jonas Bö, originally he was writing children literature. So you see this tradition of children literature pops up. He's also a lead singer of a rock band, and many of his books now have been adapted as films. One example is The Snowman, which I recommend. I've heard a lot of good things. I haven't watched it myself, but I've heard lots of good things from really fans of Jonas Bö, so I think it means it's good. The main aspects in his books are graphic violence. When I say graphic violence, I mean that it's described. It's not as well described as in the Danish case that I will talk about, but it's still quite graphic. You have a lot of blood and a lot of cutting members and bodies being dismembered and so on, these kind of things. But there is also an emphasis on psychological violence and extremes, and this is interesting. Also, the murderer is often in direct contact with the main character, who is the investigator. So there is this very toxic atmosphere, let's say. He focuses also on organized crime, including pedophilia in Thailand, and the fact that some Nordic people tend to go there for sexual tourism and so on, and violence against women as also a main theme. Most of the victims in his books are women. The main hero is Harry Holley. He's an anti-hero and probably the worst among all the examples I'm giving today. He has drug and alcohol addiction issues. He's often operating outside of the system, and there is this thing about breaking rules. So to explain it quickly, it means that he's challenging the hierarchy and the established order, which is important in Nordic society because you have the Jantelagen or Janteloven in Danish. And the law of Jante is summarized with this sentence: "You shall not think you are any better than us." And breaking the hierarchy means sending the message to readers that even if you're whoever you are, whether you are just a simple police officer, or if you're the chief of the kripos, you have to do what's right, and that means sometimes not respecting the person who is up in the hierarchy, basically. And it also shows the difficulty of staying within the system that is very heavy um, for the Nordic society. So then you have Gunnar Staalesen, who is based in Bergen. He uses this city as his main location for his novels. I will mention the trilogy of the 20th century. It's kind of Nordic Noir because it has most of the aspects, but it's very historical compared to many others. And it's a transgenerational story, so each book focuses on a different period, and all murders are somehow linked. So that's it for the first part. I will. So from now on, we're going to go quickly into, like, at least the next couple of slides are going to be slightly more complicated for some people. So feel free to leave if you so wish for at least a couple of slides, and then we will move to Millennium. So yeah, the very violent part is starting. So Denmark now. I wanted to focus specifically on Jussi Adler-Olsen because I really like his novels. He's a writer of both nonfiction and fiction. His father, so the background, the family background is very interesting for him because his father was a sexologist and focusing also on mental health. And basically that means he lived in mental health institutions during a time when they were recovering from this eugenics phase, basically. So it was a very, it had an influence, obviously, on his writing and his inspiration and so on. Of course, he used it a lot. His novels are really psychologically deep, let's say, compared to the others. He studied sociology and medicine. So again, a very well-educated background, rather elitist. I will show why it's interesting with the case of Millennium. But mostly, basically, Nordic Noir authors have this kind of background with very easy access to education, and they can afford writing even in the beginning. They're usually journalists, for instance, and they write on the side fiction, and then they drop the journalist work sometimes. Sometimes they keep it as a side job or whatever. But it's interesting to see that it's still a rather privileged milieu, let's say. And as you can see so far, there are lots of people not really representing the diversity of the population in Nordic countries. I guess you can see that it's mostly men that I'm talking about, for instance. He's interesting because in his case, he's using a team of investigators, and he's making it more inclusive than the others. Most of the time, you have white straight persons as main characters, basically. And in his case, he's adding a woman, for instance, which is rather rare from my experience, at least reading so far. Women are not often among the top main characters all the time. He's also including Assad, who has a background as a refugee, political refugee. and he's even using his background as one of the main stories for some of his books. So he's not just using it as, hey, I'm doing some representation for fun. He's really pushing this agenda of having a different population represented, really. He's focusing a lot in his books also on the policies of forced sterilization in the 50s. So as you see, the political background was really used in Nordic Noir novels. And this is just one example, but it's true for all books, except maybe in the Larsson, who is staying slightly away from politics, but still criticizing a bit the society. But yeah. So one of my favorite books from Jussi Adler-Olsen, which I really recommend, is The Purity of Vengeance, Guilt. Purity of Vengeance, I think I don't remember which one is in the US and which one is in the UK, but basically that's the difference between the two titles. There is one, they translated it differently. That's all. The main character is Karl Mörk. It's an anti-hero, and the mere fact that he's in this department Q, which is focusing on reopening old cold cases and trying to solve them. It's not a reward at all, it's a punishment, because he keeps breaking the rules and going against the hierarchy and so on. So it's a punishment, and it's literally in the basement of the building where they work. It's in the basement. They really don't want to see him, basically. They're tired of him. And so he uses a lot the historical background of Denmark and the Nordic region. And as I mentioned, graphic, physical, psychological violence, really one of the most violent. I usually tell people, if you want to start with Nordic Noir, maybe do not start with Jussi Adler-Olsen, because it's really violent and graphic. And of course, violence against women is still very present, and violence against minorities, but especially social minorities, not so much the others. So I will show you this trailer. I hope the sound works. It's one of the adaptations of one of the Department Q novels.
Backup is en route.
So with this, you can see a bit more the atmosphere that I was mentioning since the beginning, basically. You can see there is a lot of anxiety and so on. You can also see that basically, I think it's easy to guess with this trailer that there are different levels and it's very complex. It's not just one murder and that's it. It's very complex. There is usually it's a serial killer actually, and usually it's spreading. The time frame is rather long. It's not. It can be up to a few years basically of time frame. It's not necessarily just a few months or really short period of time that is covered. Um, in Victim 2117, um, which is another book by the same author and within the same series, it's focusing on the death of migrants in the Mediterranean Sea when they're trying to cross the sea to reach Europe. There is the presence of a former torturer from the Saddam Hussein regime. So as you can see, very difficult themes, very political themes. And there is then also the teenage violence, the fact that teenagers are not always innocent, and how to handle the fact that violence can happen even among young people. And cyber violence as well is very important. So it's all societal issues that are very important to Nordic society. And another very specific aspect in his case is that in his books, criminals are very intelligent. They're smart, really. Sometimes they even outsmart the main characters, the investigators. And this shows the complexity of Nordic society and the fact that basically it's his way to explain to people that criminals are not only coming from working class, they're not only stupid, they can be very intelligent, they can be wealthy people. Basically, the evil is impossible to guess from just what you can see in appearance for people. And this has multiple consequences, of course. And it's basically telling people stop being so prejudiced, especially about minorities. So now let's breathe a bit again before getting more violent again. So the Estonian case and the French case. Quickly, the Estonian case with Indrek Halgra. He used to be a diplomat, actually. He was trained in international law in Tartu. And then he decided to become a writer. His specificity is that he's using Estonian folklore, as we mentioned. This is a very important theme for him. He's bringing back witches, werewolves, ghosts. He's also doing something that is rather typical of post-Soviet or post-communist countries. So this obsession with rewriting the past, except in his case, he's not rewriting the Cold War or even the Second World War, but rather the medieval period, especially 14th and 15th century, so the end of Middle Ages. Big problem with translation. Most of his books are not translated into English. Very few are translated. So this is another open call. If you are into languages, learn Estonian and try to do something. It's really a shame because he's very talented and he's lacking international outreach, I think, unfortunately. Olivier Truc is French. He's mainly based in Sweden. His main job is journalist. You can see him on the picture, that's him. He's a journalist, both press and TV, basically. And he's basically writing for him is a side job, writing for fiction writing. What is interesting is that he's using mostly Lapland as the location, and he's giving a lot of space to Sami people and their history, their tragic history. And he's really giving so much space that, for instance, sometimes there is a murder that, well, the victim, instead of being a human being, it's a reindeer. And that's why the reindeer police is involved, because they find the dead bodies of reindeers. But in Sami culture, which is based on reindeer herding, reindeers are not just animals like, I don't know, like cows in Europe, for instance. They're really important. They respect them. Their beliefs are rooted in respecting nature and everything about nature. So they have a very close connection to their reindeers. It's not just a tool to live off their meat. It's really much more than that. So killing a reindeer is really could lead to much worse in this culture. It could be a first step towards murdering a human being. So, it, so you have a very interesting and very different setting, let's say, and I would recommend it if you want to read more about this and discover a bit more about Jokkmokk and so on, and the region over there, which is a beautiful region. Then in France, Franck Tillier is not officially Nordic Noir, and if you told him, okay, are you Nordic Noir, he would say no, hell no. But his case is helping me highlight here all the different characteristics that I mentioned so far, and that maybe were not properly highlighted, let's say. So he has a scientific background. This is common to most Nordic Noir authors. This means that they spend months, sometimes years, researching their topics. And that's his case as well. They immerse themselves into their topics. In his case, he goes as far as working on the side of teams in the um, hospital in Grenoble, which is specializing in rescuing people in the Alps, in the top of the Alps, where everything is freezing and they have to use helicopters and so on. It's a very specific unit with specification, like specialization in hypothermia and so on, for instance. So this he spends a lot of time there to learn how they work, and this way the novels are extremely realistic, obviously, because he's not just writing based on what he thinks the reality is. In Lyon, he spent some time as well working with the criminal police there. So again, a very he even contacted Interpol and so on to make sure that he knew everything, how everything works. And this is very specific, well, very typical of Nordic Noir. All authors have uh, um, this work in the background that they do before writing a book. And he's using some themes that are similar to Nordic Noir, especially psychological trauma. And his own theme that I find interesting to mention here is violence, but as a genetical aspect of human beings. So he asks the question whether violence could be a gene in the DNA of humans and whether we could intervene and in which way we could intervene on that gene. So he's mixing the line between reality and fiction is very thin, and in the psychological trauma, the limit between different realities, I will say, and you will read if you want to know what I mean with that. The thin line is extremely thin, and this is comparable to Jussi Adler-Olsen. Now, let's talk about Sweden. First, the originals. I like calling them like this because they're really important, and well, it makes a kind of parallel with Gothic and the vampires and so on. So the originals, Maeva and Per. They're the very first ones. They're a real life couple. They were, sorry, a real life couple. They basically set the main characteristics because since they were the first ones really coining that making that genre actually happen, everyone took from them this legacy and this heritage. So social criticism is very important in their novels. They used novels as a way to comment on societal issues. And as you could see so far, even outside of Sweden, most of the authors were taking from that as well. It's very present throughout Nordic Noir, whichever country you pick. The main character is Martin Beck, who is not exactly an anti-hero, but he's not the traditional hero, let's say. So it's the first step, and then later on, the following authors really went further into that. He's a skilled and efficient investigator, but when you're successful, usually it means you're going to get a promotion. And he refuses to get promoted because he doesn't want to do any administrative work. And this shows the humility that is very important in Nordic society. It shows also the fact that you do not need to be higher up in the hierarchy to do good things and and sometimes even you lack impact on the society if you go up. And this shows this kind of almost, working class thing when they started writing in the 50s and 60s, showing that maybe we should stop looking at the elite as the only solution to our problems. And so their books were adapted into films and TV shows. So feel free to dig into that. You can have fun with that. There is a lot to read and to watch. Then Henning Mankell, who died in 2015. I was lucky enough to meet him in 2013. So I can tell you that he's a very nice person. He was, sorry. You can see him in the picture. And he was very down to earth, very close to people, which is typical of Nordic authors. Usually if you meet them somewhere, feel free to talk to them and say hi and so on. They are not, even if they're well known worldwide, like Henning Mankell, they will take the time to talk to you and so on. They're very down to earth. And that's a huge quality, I think. Originally, he was, he has the background in children's literature as well, which is kind of almost compulsory in Sweden when you want to be famous in literature. You have to write children's literature at some point in your life. And he wrote the very famous Kostballander series, which was adapted by the BBC with Kenneth Branagh as main actor. His books are basically answering the question, what went wrong with Swedish society? And the answer is a lot, according to him. Political activism is very important for him, and he was similar to Olof Palme in terms of his opinions. So he was left-wing as well. This is something that is recurrent in Nordic Noir. Authors are usually left-wing. He was also including the history of the Baltic Sea region, especially during the Cold War, with spies and so on, this kind of stories. So I recommend you to read more from him. I will not say too much because there is a lot to read and watch as well in his case. Now, there is a new generation, what I call the new generation. All these authors, the names that you see there, are more or less around the same age. So that's why I put them in the same kind of generation. They took over sort of from the originals, and they adapted in their own styles and different ways. The complex scenario settings of Camilla Ekberg is very important. You can see her in the picture. She does not use just one line and that's it. No, you can have up to 3, 4 different storylines intertwined, going in parallel, going against each other. And what is interesting is that sometimes they're superposed in the same. There's this superposition in the same book, but the time frame is from a different period. So you have simultaneously something happening in the 16th century, the uh, beginning of the 20th century, and the late 20th century, for instance. And you have, and all these are connected. So it's a very complex scenario usually. The main characters are a couple, Patrick Hexström, who is a police officer, and well, officer. He's I don't remember his grade, but he's not the leader of the team, but almost. He's just under the main person at the police station. And Erika Falk, who is a writer. But she often helps him with solving crimes because she, a bit like Richard Castle, basically. It's a bit like Richard Castle, if you know the TV show, but like reversed. So the woman is the writer and the man is the police investigator. And basically she helps him with ideas because she's writing crime novels herself, Nordic Noir novels. And so she has ideas and so on, and she researches. So it's a bit interesting to see that there is this aspect. The main themes: teenage violence, violence against women, as usual. She even includes witch hunts in one of her books, which is a book that I don't recommend that well, like that much, because it's a book called The Witch, and I don't recommend it too much because of the last part of the novel. The rest is okay, but the last part is a bit too voyeurist and so on, and she includes scenes of sexual assaults that are not needed, basically, in the plot. And I was shocked that she would do that because it goes against the style of Nordic Noir, which is really staying as realistic as possible and not voyeurist at all, as we will see with Millennium. She has a background in economics, so again, this well-educated background. Erik Axel Sund, now, it's a duo of two authors who had to disclose the fact that they were not gay because everyone was wondering if they were actually hiding their couple behind this pen name and so on, but no. It's interesting that actually people were disappointed that they were not gay. That's Sweden. But what is interesting is that I've met them as well, and they're very nice, very joyful, making jokes all the time, and they're writing an extremely, almost sickening. Yeah, it's almost sickening the level of psychological violence, and the criminals are really complex in their psychology, but complex in very disturbing ways, with torture and um, you have some kidnappings happening and people being kept in rooms in flats and so on for years. And anyway, it's really, you wonder if you're, after reading this, you wonder if your neighbors don't have a secret room where someone is getting murdered. It's really bad, but it's really good literature. So you can, if you can handle the violence, feel free to read them. But their personality is the opposite of their books. Then Johan Theorin is my personal favorite in a way. because he uses Öland as his main stage, which is not usual because it's outside of it's kind of a peripheric location compared to the others. Usually it's Stockholm or Göteborg, Malmö, the main cities. And he includes a bit of explained supernatural. So you have a murder that is framed as supernatural, but then explained with actual rational facts. And he uses the difficult historical legacy of Sweden, and it's the same for Camilla Läckberg. They use both the stories of soldiers, Nazi soldiers who ended up stranded on the beach of Sweden after escaping and basically deserting the Wehrmacht. So they were Nazi soldiers, so technically it was bad, but they were also deserting, so technically it was good. And you have this issue of some women getting married to these men and so on. So yeah, difficult past. And last but not least, Lars Kepler, a couple in real life as well, and with the Jona Linna series. And we'll watch another trailer from their from one of their books to give you a bit more of an idea how the atmosphere is in the books.
Hela hans familj är mördad. Han är den enda som kan ge oss en ledtråd om vem som har gjort det. Jag måste få prata med honom.
Pojken är inte kontaktbar.
Du sa ju att det finns andra metoder.
Vilka andra metoder?
Hypnos.
Du vet att jag inte får. Josef, jag heter Erik. Jag kommer att räkna ner från 5. Du andas. 5.
Vi måste göra något. Vi kan ju inte bara sitta här. Tänk om jag somnar något.
4.
Han kommer att hitta mig.
Vem kommer att hitta dig? Vem är du rädd för?
Så sjunker vi djupare och djupare. 3.
Det finns en dotter i familjen. Jag vet inte var hon finns, men någon är ute efter henne.
2. 1. Vad händer sen?
So that's a good way again to see that Nordic Noir is often portrayed, at least visually, at least in the trailers, when they're advertising the style. They're using a lot of codes from horror films and the horror genre. So now another trigger warning, sorry for that, but I have to talk about Stieg Larsson. So feel free to leave if you want. There will be specifically sexual assault scenes and so on that will be mentioned. So yeah. So Stieg Larsson was trained technically as to be a journalist, but he failed to incorporate the big school of journalism in Sweden. This shows that basically his background was not as privileged as most of the other authors that I mentioned so far. He was from a working class family. He was also not really, he was in the periphery, a bit like Johan Theorin, because he was living in Umeå, which is located in Västerbotten, so the north of Sweden, just under Lapland, let's say. So he has this non-traditional background, let's say. for Nordic Noir, but it gave him a lot of strength in his books, making it more realistic. And yeah, for me, that's one of the main strengths that that his books have. He was really into science fiction in the beginning of his writing career, and he was a political activist, left-wing, I should probably say far left-wing, because he was a member of the Swedish Communist Party. And he actually trained within this framework of communism, international communism and so on. He trained women militarily in Eritrea in the late 70s, because he went himself he had to do his military service, and he learned certain things that could be useful for them to free themselves from oppression and so on, various kinds of oppression there. So then you have a background that is extremely important, which is the Swedish Expo Foundation. He founded it. It was a bit seen as the inspiration for Millennium, which is a newspaper, well, a journal slash magazine slash newspaper, whatever. So that's lots of people say that in Millennium he used a lot of biographical elements, and this is one of them. The newspaper, the magazine Expo was anti-racist, and he was himself anti-racist and really fighting against all forms of far-right extremism and violence. He was sometimes focusing on youth and teenagers, trying to tackle this violence from the level of high schools and so on. He was fighting, of course, this at also a research level for his journalistic activities. So he was researching a lot anti-democratic movements in Sweden. And this led him to get to know people from various backgrounds that he ended up using this as an inspiration for his books. And that's why there is so much violence in Millennium, because he's trying to condense everything, to show everything that he not went through himself, but that he witnessed or he heard and so on. And when you dive into this kind of topics, of course, your private life is threatened. Of course, well, unfortunately, of course, your private life is threatened, and that's why he never got married. He was with Eva Gabrielsson. This meant that when he died of a heart attack because of, well, poor life hygiene, basically, and poor work-life balance. That's the message also. Don't get into this kind of toxic behaviors if you can avoid it. Take time to breathe every now and then. And he did not get married because in Sweden back then, when you were getting married, your common address was becoming public. This means that his enemies in the far right world, let's say, could have basically targeted his partner, and he tried to protect her. And this kind of protection, again, was not sexist in his case, because his partner was involved in social and political activism as well. Not as much as him, but really it was simply to protect their private life. And this shows in the character of Mikael Blomqvist a lot, who is a character who tries helping and protecting women around him but never in a way that would not be respectful, and this is very important. So in the Millennium trilogy, which is called a trilogy, but actually it was supposed to be 10 novels. So far, 3 finished by Stieg Larsson himself, 3 written by someone else and published, all of them published posthumously. That's very important. He never knew the fame that he got. He will never know how important he was for not just literature, but and Nordic Noir, but also for even survivors and women and people from marginalized communities and so on, because he represented as many as he could in his book. A lot remains unpublished because the person who wrote those 3 novels is not his partner, and that's something that I disagree with. Unfortunately, they did not give the rights to her, but to someone else. And this is a shame because she has all the drafts, and she shared most of his fights, and most of she knew him better than anyone else, so she could have written something much closer to what he wanted to write. So yeah, this shows how money has to do with everything still. So the main plot, well, it's actually difficult to just summarize with just one plot. There is the main plot of Lisbeth Salander, Lisbeth Salander is the main character, let's say. She's fighting for her independence as an adult woman after being caught in a system that alienates minorities and marginalized people. Her father was violent when she was little towards her mother especially, but also herself. And she got pissed one day, and she was having issues, behavioral issues and so on, due to the abuse and what she was witnessing and so on. And instead of helping her, they put her in a system where she would have to have a guardian, basically a legal guardian, that would do everything for her. The first she got was really good, helping her and giving her a lot of freedom and so on. This is Holger Palmgren, sorry. He was very nice to her and so on. The problem is that he had a stroke at some point and he had to retire. This means that this job was taken over by Nils Björkman, who was, well, the worst kind of man you can think of somehow. Well, not the worst maybe, but one of the worst, definitely in the top 3. So he uses his guardianship in a way to abuse her sexually multiple times, and she gets pissed. And well, she knows how to take her life in her own hands and take control again. So she decides to put a hidden camera at his place, and what she doesn't expect, major trigger warning, is that he ends up raping her, and the rape is caught on tape, basically, without him knowing that. She then uses this tape to take control over her life again, but it gets much more complicated than that, because the system does not want her to take over, basically, because they are scared of what she could do, because she's a very skilled hacker. So she hacks in everyone's computers and so on. She steals money, and but always from people who are not doing good things. Always from people who are, as the title of the first book says, "Men som hatar kvinnor," which means men who hate women. So she's always targeting those people. Then you have another storyline in the first book, especially with a criminal investigation, focusing on a cold case, and that's how she meets Mikael Blomqvist, basically. We start with actually Mikael Blomqvist as main character, but then we realize that they're both important. So of course, as you guest main themes: violence against women and minorities. When I say minorities, also the sexual aspect is important for him, sexual identities and so on, because you have bisexuals, you have then ethnic minorities with, I think Mimi is from Asian background, I think, ethnically, if I remember well. I don't want to say something that would be wrong, but I think so. He's trying to cover as much as possible. Lisbeth's father is, well, a very bad guy, but also from another country, so you have another immigrant background. And he's trying really to balance all those characters, to have good people and bad people on all sides. It's very important. For instance, yeah, I mean, I won't go into details, but yeah. So the question is whether it is Nordic Noir or not, because some people challenge that it would be Nordic Noir because they think, well, it's again this problem with Nordic Noir being a subgenre that is not very well appreciated, let's say. So let's go through different aspects. There is the omnipresence of criminal investigations. In the first book, you have the Wenger family, where the father, well, grandfather technically, teaches well, he basically, you have a father teaching his son a tradition of sexual assault as a ritual, sexual assault against women as a ritual, and basically that's the main criminal investigation in the first book. And then you have the murders that Lisbeth Salander is accused of in the second and third books. So you have this very important part of Nordic Noir. Investigative journalism is used instead of police investigation. I think that this is because Stieg Larsson wanted to show that the system overall is failing. Remember, he's far left politically. He's not moderate at all, and he's really critical. There is a heavy social criticism, and you can find all the usual themes that I mentioned in. You can really get through all the different themes throughout the three books and later as well. The dark atmosphere is also present. You have these kind of scenes where they're hiding in places in winter and so on. You have suspense and everything, and you can really see it in the films as well. And then you have a very big focus on personal lives of the main characters, which is even more developed than in other Nordic Noir books, because they have, well, sometimes it's their lives become, well, especially in the case of Lisbeth Salander, her life becomes the actual plot. So that's really pushing Nordic Noir, one of the typical trait of Nordic Noir, to the maximum, basically. And it's very violent, but it also has historical and political background and in-depth research by the author, who was, as I mentioned, a journalist and digging into all these topics, and he was really using things that he had researched. So you have all the cocktail that you need, all the ingredients for the cocktail you need to have Nordic Noir, basically. Quickly about the films, I will just mention that why would Americans take over this to do something? It doesn't make sense. Basically, you have three Swedish films that are really, really great. Of course, be careful, trigger warning again, when you watch them. The rape scene is just as in the books, it's repeated multiple times. So you see it multiple times, and it's a very realistic scene. this is important. The realism of everything happening is very important, because in American films and fiction and so on, usually have a bit of voyeurism. It's a bit romanticized, let's say. It's a bit more, it doesn't look as traumatic as it could actually be. And in Millennium, that's not the case. The scene is really depicted both in the written and in the film versions. It's really depicted in a way that is not pleasant to read or watch. You do not want to watch this, and you feel uncomfortable. And I mean, maybe there are some people who are really voyeurist who are still finding it interesting, but honestly, so far I've heard only people saying, how can you watch that? I watched just 2 seconds of it and it was too much. It's really, really graphically realistic and everything, and this is very important. Stieg Larsson really gave justice in his books to survivors and victims of sexual assaults. He did not do it in a bad way, let's say, even though he was a man and had, as far as we know, no experience with that. He really listened to survivors and their testimonies and so on to write this, and it shows, really. So I would not recommend, basically, watching the American film. So quickly, I wanted to add this, Let the Right One In. It's a bit lighter now compared to Millennium, but it's the story of a young boy who is bullied at school, and bullying at school is another recurrent theme of Nordic Noir. So he is helped. So the location is again Umeå, so in the north, and basically he's helped by a girl who turns out to be a vampire, and that's why she can help him so well. She has additional strength and so on. In terms of themes, you have this conflict between the word of youth, young people, children, and the word of adults. Social criticism is very present, especially regarding the topic of the Nordic society's failure to protect children despite a very difficult system, let's say. It's almost traumatic sometimes for even children. It's supposed to be protecting them, but it's very difficult for them because a very small thing like raising the hand towards the child like this could lead to an investigation into the family's background and seeing if it's a pattern of abuse. And during this investigation, children are taken away from their families. So it's really a background that is difficult, basically, and it basically criticizes this very naive approach to children's world, where violence is supposedly completely absent, whereas it's not. It has a dark atmosphere and some crimes because, you know, a vampire needs to be fed and needs to feed, and it needs humans. So yeah, there are a few murders, of course. And it's almost a case of, I would say, children literature with Nordic Noir, like Nordic Noir children literature, which is crazy because from, at least, I don't know about your backgrounds, but from the French perspective, for instance, children literature is usually nice and cute and yeah, lots of light topics and so on, whereas Nordic Noir is really heavy. And in Nordic literature, in Nordic countries, the children literature is usually tackling very difficult topics, even death and illness and rape and so on. So really, it's the tradition with these fairy tales and so on that are very educative, and yeah, they have a very developed children's literature. So quickly showing trailer for Let the Right Hand In, Låt den rätta komma in. 2000s. It's really happening a lot with the rise of far right. And I mean, it happened already in 1986 with the assassination of Olof Palme, where violence got turned up at maximum volume. And more recently in 2011 with the terrorist attacks in Oslo and Utøya. So this shows really how Nordic society is technically a model, but it's very difficult for them. There is a huge pressure to continue getting better, improving, and trying to maintain what they have. It's also a difficulty of Nordic Noir shows also the difficulty of Nordic society to handle otherness and other identities that do not fit in this frame that they built throughout the decades, throughout the past decades. For instance, if still to this day, if you're too different, if you look too different, sometimes you are seen as, well, in a negative way. It's changing a lot, of course. There is more tolerance and open-mindedness and so on. But sometimes this open-mindedness is very much at the surface and not really being taken over by the society and the system. So this is showing. This is what Nordic Noir shows in terms of the mirror. It's a mirror showing all the ugliness, but very important aspect. They usually tell the reader how to solve the problem in advance. So sometimes just making sure that you are kind to others and these kind of things. But sometimes it goes a bit further and just understanding that, for instance, if one person commits a crime, that means that the society failed at preventing this crime from happening. And this, basically the society should help him or them or her getting back into the right track, let's say the right path. So I will end here. I have one last trailer, but since I went over time, I will stop here, I think. Thank you, everyone.